Today we're going to be talking about if it's normal to still love your ex after years apart. So in my opinion, it actually can be normal to still love your ex after years. However, a person's ability to move on completely from their ex after years apart is often indicative of where they are on the avoidant self-fulfilling cycle. Now, I know that's a bit confusing, and I imagine if you aren't familiar with what the avoidant self-fulfilling cycle is, you're not going to really understand anything that's going on. So for now, here's a quick list of the things that we're going to be covering in this video. First off, we're going to be talking about anxious people versus avoidant people when it comes to letting go. Because one of the interesting things that we found is it's contrary to what you would believe. We're also going to be talking about the understanding of the avoidant self-fulfilling cycle, and finally, the phantom ex syndrome. So let's start first by basically talking about anxious people and avoidant people when it comes to letting go, because I think this is going to be really helpful in our discussion on love and if it's normal for you to love an ex after years have gone by. So it may seem a bit odd that I'm talking so much about attachment styles when it comes to understanding the dynamics on if it's normal to still be hung up on your ex after years apart. But I'm a pretty firm believer that attachment styles can give you direct insight into post-breakup behaviors. So getting intimate with understanding how they work is kind of an essential part of the process. Now, according to our internal research, we found that most of our clients, the person who was broken up with, tend to be more anxious. In fact, we did a recent poll, or not me actually, one of the clients in our private Facebook support group was kind enough to actually conduct a poll of the people, and anxious preoccupied seemed to be the top answer for the attachment style in the group. So most of our clients tend to veer more towards anxious attachment style. Now, what is the anxious attachment style? Well, you're considered as having an anxious attachment style if you have a greater need for intimacy or closeness. Sounds good, right? Well, the problem really lies that someone with this style requires frequent reassurance of their partner's love and commitment to the relationship. And oftentimes this can be overbearing in the relationship to extremes. So I'll circle back around to this in a moment. Now, on the other hand, we found that a lot of our clients' exes tend to veer more towards avoidant attachment styles, like almost like 70 to 80% of them. That means an avoidant will basically be someone who's extremely independent, self-directed. Often they're uncomfortable with intimacy. They're basically commitment phobes and experts at rationalizing their way out of any intimate situation. But really what this video is going to be doing is studying the dynamics of someone who's caught up in their ex after years apart. Now, the natural inclination would be to assume that the anxious person would be more hung up on their exes after years apart, right? Well, that's actually not what we found. It's true that anxious individuals don't handle breakups well. They blow up their ex's phone. They beg for their exes back. They show up unannounced at their ex's work. They're constantly seeking validation from that ex, even when that ex is with someone new. But after years have gone by, what typically happens is the anxious person finds someone new to seek that validation from. They move on and hyper-focus on that person. That's not to say they don't think about their exes from time to time. They definitely do, but they're often looking to the future. Now, on the other hand, avoidants often live in the past. They're constantly seeking something they can't have. Therefore, avoidant exes tend to be the ones more likely to harbor love after years apart, or at least love-like behaviors. And we think it has to do with this interesting little self-fulfilling cycle that they get caught up on. So on our website, I actually put together this really cool graphic that kind of simulates a wheel and the 8 stages of a self-fulfilling cycle. So essentially, I've talked about this a lot the past few months on the YouTube channel, podcast, and the website, and you're probably getting tired of hearing about it, but I'm a firm believer that understanding this cycle can help you learn a lot about post-breakup behaviors. So there are essentially 8 stages to this cycle. First stage is the avoidant starts out wanting someone to love them. Second stage is they date this person and things are great at first. The third stage is eventually that person's need for open communication and intimacy triggers their avoidant side. The fourth phase is the avoidant begins to consider leaving the relationship. The fifth phase is they actually leave the relationship. The sixth phase is they're ecstatic that they left the relationship. The seventh phase is they begin to feel lonely and they need to find a distraction for the loss. And finally, the eighth phase is they enter victim mentality and wonder why this is always happening to them. And then They repeat the stages over and over again. Now, it's important to take into consideration that the cycle moves like a wheel going around and around. So sometimes it goes around with the same person, meaning you're getting this on-again, off-again relationship where this cycle continues to repeat. And sometimes it goes around with multiple people, meaning they go around the wheel once with you, they move on to someone new, they go around the wheel once with that person, they move on to someone new. So it's a lot of rebound type stuff. And what truly matters is that you understand for an avoidant, unless they somehow become more secure, they're always going to be caught up in this cycle.
Real quick, I want to say that if you're new to this YouTube channel or you're trying to figure out what you should be doing to get your ex back and you're trying to learn if you even have a chance in your specific circumstance, probably the smartest thing for you to do is actually stop by our website, www.exboyfriendrecovery.com, or take our Ex Recovery Chances quiz that can be found at exboyfriendrecovery.com. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, taking that free quiz is super easy to do. All you have to simply do is look in the description link below this YouTube video and click on the link you see there. It will take you directly to the quiz where you can fill it out and get an easy answer on what you should be doing going forward and overall what your chances look like in your specific situation. All right, so let's get you back to the video.
Now let's assume that your ex broke up with you and then years later gets back in touch with you. Very similar to actually what happened to one of my first podcast questions ever. So to give you a little bit of history, a woman named Natalie called in and presented the following situation to me. So it had been 2 years since the breakup with her ex. In that 2 years, she had started her own business, started dating again. She starts to feel really confident. Then her ex kind of comes back into the picture, congratulating her. When she was with him, she didn't really do a good job of having her own life and going out with friends. So now that she does have her own life years after the fact, he started finding her attractive again and asking her out. Now, what's probably happening in Natalie's situation with her ex is that he is going through the multiple variations of this cycle with different people. So he's gone through the cycle with Natalie, then he's gone through the self-fulfilling cycle with a few other people, and eventually he gets to this specific stage, stage 7. I'm starting to feel kind of lonely. And he does what a typical avoidant person does and starts reminiscing about the past. Now, we know this is common breakup behavior based on our research on nostalgia. So essentially, one of the big findings we found about avoidance is the avoidant is not going to start getting nostalgia about their ex until after they feel safe. And usually, they're only going to feel safe if the following criteria has happened. 1, they're in a relationship with someone else. Now they're safe to fawn over an ex. 2, you're in a relationship with someone else. Now they're safe to fawn over you because there's no way that you're trying to get them back. And 3, a lot of time has gone by. Starting to sound familiar, right? Now, another really interesting thing can happen to propagate this longing with an avoidant years after the breakup, and that's the origin of the Phantom X. Now, I'm going to do you a solid. Probably one of the best websites I've ever found on attachment styles, specifically avoidant attachment styles, is a website called freetoattach.com. Now, on that website, they talk about the introduction of the Phantom X. Specifically, they say an avoidant person often has the story of a perfect ex in a relationship that wasn't fully realized, the one that got away, to whom no one else can measure up. So what I often think happens when people are getting hung up on exes after years apart, they're expelling love-like behaviors, is it's because they're painting that ex as a phantom ex during the specific phase where they start to feel lonely. Then they wonder, why can't I ever find the right person? And then they wonder or want to basically say, I want someone to love me. When they're in that phase of the self-fulfilling cycle, that's when they're most likely to quote-unquote fall back in love with the Phantom X or bring that Phantom X mentality up into the forefront of their mind. Now, whether that person has gone through a recent breakup or they've just been alone, they're perpetually stuck feeling lonely. And when that happens, they're hearkening back to what feels comfortable. So oftentimes what I find interesting about, hey, is it normal to still love your ex after years? Usually you're asking that question, or whoever you're asking the question about, they've gone through a recent breakup or they've gone through a real long dry spell where they're starting to feel kind of lonely. And that's when they're susceptible to feeling love, if you will. For the avoidant, the idealized version of a partner is kind of the most comfortable thing that they latch onto. So fawning from afar is definitely on brand for them, but perhaps even more interesting is how perfectly this fits into the peak end rule research. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the peak end rule is defined as a cognitive bias that impacts how people remember past events. So intense positive or negative moments, the peaks, and the final moments of the experience, the end, are heavily weighted in our mental calculus. So what we're dealing with here is a large amount of time, sometimes years. It makes sense that the way we remember past relationships becomes slightly altered after a few years go by. During a breakup, our memory tends to hyperfocus on the end of the relationship, and usually that end is fraught with arguments and pain. You aren't exactly a perfect Phantom X candidate for your avoidant ex immediately after a breakup. But with time, usually a lot of it, the calculus suddenly changes. Those end moments that seem awful begin to be forgotten, and the focus becomes purely about the peak moments, specifically the peak positive moments. So going back to free to attach, the Phantom X operates because there is/was distance, not because the relationship was successful, but a fixation with a past partner affects budding new relationships, blocking them from getting close to someone else. Just the knowledge that this person is out there is enough to make any new partner seem insignificant by comparison, a subconscious distancing strategy for the avoidant. Now remember, an avoidant values their own independence and autonomy over everything else. So a perfect relationship for them is one where they can keep full autonomy of their independence and admire you from afar. Starting to sound familiar? So for me personally, the question was never if it's normal to still love your ex after years. It's more about why people can still love your ex or their ex after years. Once you figure that out and point to real research for why this is happening, you gain complete control over how to handle it, whether that's trying to get that ex back or trying to move on from that ex. But simply by saying, yeah, it's normal for an ex to fall in love with you after years apart isn't good enough anymore. What really matters is finding out why. And we believe it's a combination of the three factors. Number one, it's a combination of the fact that your ex is probably an avoidant. Number two, it's a combination of the fact that your ex as an avoidant is going through the self-fulfilling cycle, and when they go through the self-fulfilling cycle, specifically when they're going through a breakup again or they're going through a dry spell and they're starting to feel lonely, they're susceptible to the Phantom X syndrome. And the Phantom X syndrome, you will likely be painted as a Phantom X if years have gone by and there are some peak moments for them to hang on to.